Thank you very much for coming. Look, you're all in 3D, and some of you are exploiting the third dimension and standing up there. We are now the Bennett Institute for Applied Data Science, and we are different to other university teams in three important ways. Firstly, we take large health and scientific data sets and turn them into research papers, like everybody else, of course, but we also produce live, interactive, data-driven tools and services for everyone to use. Secondly, we do work that is of academic, pure research paper importance, but we don't set too much store by putting our outputs in PDFs on the websites run by academic journal publishing monopolists. We're also interested in using data to monitor clinical activity and outcomes in the NHS to have a direct impact on the delivery of care, because the biggest benefits to society, the best way to prevent suffering and death, is probably not through a PDF on a journal website or even through inventing a new drug safe for diabetes. It's by optimizing the logistics of the delivery of care, and we have no shame in finding that to be our greatest passion. And then, lastly, to do all of this, we need different personnel. We don't only produce research papers, so we don't only employ researchers. We also employ policy wonks, as you will see, and full-stack commercial-grade software developers. The people that you will hear from today, they are not the statistician in your group who is weirdly good at writing R scripts. They are people who came to us by working on a corner of a major global operating system or the back end of a global retail outfit. They come to us with those skills, and we share with them knowledge about how NHS data works, how epidemiology works. And conversely, our researchers pick up what software development actually looks like in real practice. And by fusing those skills and knowledge, we're able to produce what I think is something very new. So, against everything in me, today I will barely speak at all. Today, until 5, it is nothing but our team. First session, I work on research integrity, clinical trials reporting, incorrect clinical trials reporting, monitoring clinical trials reporting, campaigning around clinical trials reporting. Next, open prescribing, I work monitoring clinical activity and outcomes through prescribing data in the NHS. Then, open safely, how we built what is probably the world's largest electronic health records research platform. And then lastly, what we did with it. And the last session is not just us. It is our enormous collaborative research community. There are 3 practical things I need to tell you. First of all, nobody's expecting a fire alarm, so if it goes off, you might die. So run. There's a staircase here, it's quite narrow, so just remember politeness kills in a fire. There's also a staircase that way. That staircase is important for the second thing you need to know, which is the toilets are there, out by the T. If you want to go and have a wee in the middle of a session, you can walk up here and publicly announce it, or you can go quietly out through that door and no one will know that you are a biological being with a bladder and genitalia. Lastly, 2 more things. Wi-Fi. By special arrangement, and it was special arrangement, we have easy quick login. Thank you very much to Jesus. Use Jesus in the sentence. So jc.have5 and Wi-Fi and Bennett Institute is the password just for today. And then lastly, Q&A. We are doing a very, very fast-paced, fast-packed event. We have some long talks, but mostly we have lightning talks. 3.5 minutes, no more than 3 slides except by special arrangement. So post your questions as you go, as they come to you, on here, BennettOxacuck/questions. We will pick them up as we go. They will be upvoted and all of that. We'll pick a small number to answer today, and the ones that are left over we will answer online. Have I forgotten anything of any great importance? No. In that case, on with Nick DeVito. Thank you.
Hello. as my speakers gather behind me. Hi everyone, I'm Nick DeVito. I've been at the Bennett Institute since before it was the Bennett Institute, since 2017, first as a researcher, then as a PhD student, and now as a postdoc. And as Ben said, this session is sort of about some of the other stuff we do at the Bennett Institute, which focuses on research integrity, our sort of obsession with open science, and our policy work. Sometimes intermingling those things, sometimes doing discrete things amongst them. So during my session today, you're going to hear first from Tracey from Sense About Science, who will talk about the AllTrials Campaign, which Ben co-founded with Sense About Science, and a few other actors, some of whom might be represented throughout the day today in the crowd. Then I will take on and talk about how we turn that into our TrialsTracker research program and give a quick overview of that. Then Henry Drysdale will be chatting about the COMPare Trials Project, which is a really interesting project about how we don't necessarily need trials reported, but we need them reported to a sufficient quality, and some of the work that we did to try to help check out the current and fix the current state of that. Then we move on to Christine Cunningham, who will talk about our ongoing RetractoBot project. So that's something that's actively happening and is in development right now. Then we'll go to Will Hume, who will talk about that fanatic approach to open science and open methods, and particularly open code. And finally, Jeff Morley will talk about our sort of flagship policy output, which is the Goldacre review that we did for the government and was published last year. So with that in mind, I just wanted to say, we threw these slides up. These are all the people who have given us money to fund our work and support us. So very much appreciative of all of them. This slide will be popping up interstitially throughout the day. And great, I'm going to hand it over to Tracey.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you very much. Right, what am I pushing these arrows to move along?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So Ben hasn't always been the genial character that you see today. When he pitched up in my office in 2012, shortly after he'd published Bad Pharma, he was fuming and very angry and spoke even more loudly than you just heard. The problem, the frustration that he was expressing was that many of the trials on the medicines in use today, around 50%, there's a discussion to be had there, were not published. And that despite the fact that he had written a world bestseller that was across the sort of boundary from academia into popular literature, that he'd written about this in the pages of newspapers, that very distinguished people, some of whom are here, Ian Chalmers and Richard Laban, had publicised this issue for some time, had written about it, talked about it at the World Medical Organization, and so on. No one seemed able to actually crack that nut. And he came to us, I think, on the basis that we so far at that point hadn't lost a fight. We're a campaigning charity that promotes the public interest in sound science and evidence. So the problem was that many trials on the medicines we use today had not been published. This meant that the research base was inaccurate. And now it's not like a research base in geology being inaccurate. This, of course, meant that there was a lot of waste, a lot of repeat trials, which we found much evidence of in the years that followed, where patients were unnecessarily being endangered and put at risk to go through the same procedures that had already been tested, the same compounds that had already been trialled, and so on. It was fundamentally bad medical practice. It meant that judgments were being made about suitable medicines for people for whom it may be completely unsuitable. It meant more than that. It meant that there was a betrayal of the patients who had invested their time and put themselves at risk to be in those trials in the first place on the basis that they were contributing to the stock of human knowledge. And of course, when it sat in somebody's drawer in a pharma company or in a clinical trial unit in a university, clearly that's not happening. It meant something else too. It meant that we had a bad baseline for future medicines. It meant that when we compared a new medicine, when companies developed a new compound, they were comparing it against something that possibly wasn't as good as people were saying it was. It may well be that a new medicine could have reduced the risk for stroke, but we didn't know that it was an elevated risk because that trial hadn't been published. So we had a really bad baseline too. So here's the issue. It's a paper from Joseph Ross, 2009. It's one of many papers. Around half of clinical trials hadn't been published. This was something that over the course of the ensuing campaign, AllTrials that we set up, there was a lot of pernickety debate And quite hilariously, everyone who went to investigate further generally found that it was less than half of trials had been published. So we were being pretty generous, we felt, and this is a paper based on the clinicaltrials.gov register. Now, the registers around the world were where people were now being forced to publish their trials, and the results were not going up. So here's AllTrials, the campaign that we published. What to do? Well, the first thing was to mobilise the public, and that's the first lever that we pulled. We also pulled the lever of shareholders. We ended up with 3 trillion euros under investment, shareholders being active and pushing companies. Surprisingly, no, not surprisingly, shareholders are very interested in transparency. A big movement was GSK finally joined and gave the lie to the idea that there was too much IP and too much patient confidentiality. But I think the big thing that changed everything was that we involved and mobilised the public. We put it in their voices. The key moment here is when the EU Clinical Trials Directive, we added an amendment to that and pushed for that, when the MEPs were surrounded by over 100 pharma lobbyists in the chamber of the European Parliament. The MEPs were waving letters, and so many of them, from citizens all over Europe that had written to them to talk about why they thought clinical trial transparency mattered. What might have seemed to many people an esoteric subject that belonged in the pages of the medical journals actually went into the mouths of patients, doctors, and ordinary consumers around the world. And in the end, we looked at how... Where are we? Let's just jump. Okay. And we looked many times at what we could do to make sure this never happened again as we began to rectify it, as we got towards those 90-something% of trials being published under the pressure of the public and other levers we were pushing. And one of those big ones was getting all of the funders to sign up to audit the people they funded, to keep funding people who didn't publish the last trial they had been funded to do. And that made a huge change. But what really made the change, and I'm stealing some of his thunder now, was the TrialsTracker, which Nick is going to talk about, really showing people the best and the worst in their field, whether that's academics or companies or trial agencies. I just want to finish by saying that fundamentally, the thing that builds the success of a campaign is being able to show what good looks like and to build those pathways to achieve it, to make it more and more and more uncomfortable to be in bad practice and easier and more congratulatory to be in good practice. And I think the TrialsTracker was a piece of genius that took us that last step. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tracey. So I'm going to talk about, I'll elaborate a bit on the TrialsTracker Project, which has been the last 5 years of my life. I've been talking about this, including an entire doctoral thesis. So we built the TrialsTracker to check compliance with regulatory guidelines. And we have the FDA TrialsTracker, which checks compliance with US guidelines, law actually. And I could talk a lot about the impact this has had and how it works, how we show individual trial level data, how we show the potential fines that the government could have collected in lieu of these late and unreported trials, and they haven't collected a dime as of yet. They've only sent 4 notices to date of final official report your trial or we might consider punishing you. But I also really wanted to point out and pepper in some of those characteristics of our work that Ben talked about in the beginning, where we launched this, we've had this running continuously for 5 years with very little technical upkeep. You can see it's barely changed at all other than the numbers and a few more features here and there, which is really extraordinary and a testament to, I think, the strength of our approach and longevity and the value of it. So this tool has just been continuously operating for 5 years. The EU Trials Tracker does the same thing. That updates every month instead of potentially every workday. And I will brag a little bit about the impact here because we launched this also in 2018, and we caught the attention of Parliament when we did this, and they were holding hearings on trials transparency at the time. Ben spoke at those. We gave evidence. And then they ended up sending letters to every public research institution in the country saying, we think that you have insufficiently met the EU reporting guidelines. This was, of course, back when we were still beholden to EU reporting guidelines. And I love this slide because it really shows. So this is every sponsor in the UK that had more than 50 trials on the tracker when we launched, and what they looked like when our first data poll for this project in January 2018 to as of the most recent update last month. And you can see half of that population of sponsors is at 100%. Almost everyone's at 98%, which is a rounding error away. And everyone but one is above 90%, which is extraordinary. Like, we now are like very confident about what the results look like for those clinical trials, and what happened to a lot of those clinical trials will only be available to you on the EU Clinical Trial Register. And just to really highlight how that the approach that we take at the Bennett Institute contributed to this, I was, when I first joined, I only had a master's degree in health policy, and I got really, entrenched in how these registries work, the legislation behind them, and the research looking into them. That sort of, Ben's like, we're going to build these trackers, Nick. Go forth, learn, and become an expert in this. And then, I got to work with Seb, who you're going to hear from at various points today, I think. And, Seb is an expert software engineer, full stack, and Python, SQL, Django, and all the other matrixy things that make all of our brilliant software run. And, there's a lot of knowledge exchange there. He may have forgotten some of it since we first launched, but Seb probably learned a lot more about the FDA Amendments Act than he ever thought he would. And I picked up some Python and SQL along the way that has served me quite well subsequently. So that approach is really integral, and I think you'll hear about that both implicitly and explicitly throughout the day. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Henry now.
Thanks, morning. So 3.5 minutes, is it? Okay. So with the COMPare project, we looked at a problem called outcome switching, which is when trialists report different outcomes from what they said they were going to report and don't declare the change. It's a bad thing because it produces a misleading picture of the true results of a clinical trial, which can exaggerate the benefits and downplay the harms of a treatment. So with COMPare, we looked at a cohort of 67 clinical trials published in 5 top medical journals. We found that 87% of them reported different outcomes from those they had pre-specified. We already knew that outcome switching was common, but with COMPare we added a new step. We submitted a letter to the journal that published the trial for every misreported trial we found. So we ended up submitting 58 correction letters to the editors of these journals. And we had a variety of surprising responses. The BMJ published our letters, and they issued a correction on one trial in response to our letter, but they issued no correction on another similar trial with errors. The Lancet published all of our letters, along with a response to each, I think there were 20 in total, from the trial authors, but they made no comment as editors themselves. JAMA didn't publish any of our 11 correction letters on the basis that they were too vague and that they contained repetition between letters. Annals of Internal Medicine published our letters, but they also published this long critique, sort of rebuttal of our methods, really, where they said, we rely primarily on the protocol for details about pre-specified primary and secondary outcomes, but we found that protocols weren't available for any of the Annals trials. And they said, regardless of pre-specification, bad start. We sometimes require the published article to improve on the pre-specified methods. Despite our response to this rebuttal, they issued this warning to their readers where they said, we do not believe that COMPare's comments merits a response. The New England Journal of Medicine rejected all 20 of our correction letters, and they said, space constraints in the journal do not allow for all outcomes to be reported, but we found that they'd made space to silently add a total of 63 outcomes to their trials that they hadn't pre-specified. They said, we do not and never have required authors to comply with consort. These are the very widely used guidelines that Nedgen themselves endorse on what to include in trial reports. And more concerningly, they said, rather review each piece individually and add the data as appropriate. I'm often asked if I think that outcome switching is usually deliberate, or if it's unconscious bias, or if it's just accidental. And to be honest, I don't think it matters, because problems like outcome switching always produce a misleading picture of the true results of a clinical trial. And a culture of permissiveness around such issues, particularly from journal editors, allows for those cases where this misleading picture of trial results causes patient harm. Thank you.
So hi, my name is Cunningham. Today I'm going to be talking about RetractoBot, which is the software we've developed to run a randomized trial investigating citations of retracted papers. And so what is a retracted paper? In the best case, an author realized they made a mistake in their methods and their analyses, and which impacts their results. And they contact the journal and they say, we need to fix this, maybe, and it gets retracted, and maybe they'll publish their fixed results later. In the worst case, there may have been fraud, plagiarisms, ethics violation, image manipulation, or duplication, and after an investigation, the publishers decide to pull the paper back. And you can see on the left here is what, if you go on the PubMed database, what a retracted paper might look like. They have this banner with sometimes linked to the retraction notice. And on the right side, we have a count of retraction notices over time. See, this is steadily increasing, and in 2022, there were over 2,000 retraction notices. But so why is this a problem? The question is, do people who are citing this research realize that they're citing a retracted paper? And so this is a table of the top 5 most cited retracted papers we have in our database. And if you look in the column on the right, you can see varying percentages that were cited after the paper was retracted. And so, as I said, we want to figure out, or want to make sure that the authors know that they're citing a retracted paper in case it impacts their analyses. And so what we are doing is we've developed this software that scrapes the PubMed database, publicly available, and working with our sponsor, Elsevier, we have access to the email addresses of the corresponding authors. And yeah, we've developed the software that's going to randomize half the retracted papers into our intervention group, which they'll get an email, and half the randomized papers into the control group. And so we're emailing the authors who cited this retracted paper. And then we're going to follow up over time and look to compare the rates of citations of retracted papers in the 2 groups. And so this is a sample of the email that we're going to send people. It's going to have the list of their citing papers, which retracted papers they cited, with links to those retraction notices, so they can see the titles and the dates and so forth. And then we'll ask them a question, did you know these papers were retracted? And then what's next for us? We're currently in the process, we've submitted a registered report, which means we're getting peer review on our methods before we randomize anyone into the trial. And we're in the process of responding to reviewer comments for this. And then hopefully, very soon we'll be sending out a lot of emails. And that's it for RetractoBot.
Hello, I'm Will, and I'm going to talk a bit about the open science practices that we follow quite evangelically at the Bennett Institute and why that's important. So firstly, what is open research? It's really anything that you can do to help people find and access your research, to understand and critique it, to reuse and adapt it, to hold people to hold you account for that research, and ultimately to improve trust in the research that you do. It's not just about sharing code. So it's possible that you could add a R script to a Dropbox drive somewhere and tell people about it if they ask for it. So in that situation, the code is open, but it's not open in the way that you want it to be to help people understand and reuse the code. So what openness really looks like is this. This is GitHub, and this is a selection of the repositories that we have within the Bennett Institute, which is where all of our code is openly available. These wiggly green lines is an indication of how active those repositories are. So there's lots of activity going on here. These are active, ongoing projects that are under constant development where all the changes are audited and tested. It's not just a code dump at the end of a year project that was requested by the funder a long time after the project was closed. These are living things. You probably can't see from these screenshots, but we also try to include the word open in lots of our projects, and that's really helpful to communicate how important openness is, but it's also a reminder that openness has meaning and provides value and trust that is diminished if the openness is not available. So for open prescribing, for example, that couldn't exist without open data that NHS England provide on practices prescribing the drugs that practices prescribe. And for open safely, it means, for example, like the data is absolutely not open, it's incredibly sensitive, but that doesn't mean that the tools and workflows that surround the use of that data shouldn't also be open. And we also want to make openness really, really easy to do. Like, it's making the right thing the easy thing. So we do this day to day with defaults and standards, with documentation, with sort of well-designed tools and workflows and checklists. And also a culture that encourages people to share things early and often, first drafts, all these sorts of things, so that there's as little friction as possible when people are thinking about whether to share their work, and ultimately to try and make transparency thrive. And we like to show other people how to do it, so there's a selection of papers that are promoting open working practices or making recommendations about about what can be done to make open working practices easier throughout the entire research community. It's good for researchers, it's good for policymakers, it's good for practitioners, ultimately it's good for trust, and it's good for the whole of society. Speaking of recommendations, the Goldacre review is what Jess is going to talk about, and that's really the crowning glory in this sort of bit of work that we're doing. Thanks, Jess.
Right, that was an exceptionally good segue. Okay, so I am now going to attempt to summarise what is effectively a book in 3.5 minutes, so we'll see how this goes. I'm Jess, as Ben said, I'm a policy wonk, floats around in the Bennett Institute. This is the report that we were commissioned to write, or Ben was commissioned to write, back in 2021 by Matt Hancock, if you can remember that far back in Secretary of State. It was then published by Sajid Javid, and it's now being implemented by Steve Barclay, because that's the world in which we live. So, why did we get asked to do it? Well, because the government has had a problem typically trying to balance the need to give broad access to data for analytics purposes and maintain patient and public privacy, and therefore maintain patient and public trust. So that was the core question. If you go online and you look at the full terms of references, they are significant. It is possibly the very definition of biting off more than you can chew, but we did it anyway. But the core issue was, how do we make sure that people have broad access and good access to the data in which they need to do research and analysis whilst maintaining privacy and in maintaining public trust. So how did we do this? Well, we had some help from Nicola Hamilton, who was sitting back there, who was our secretariat from the Department of Health and Social Care. And we did more than 200 interviews with people across the space. We did a bunch of focus groups with people from different perspectives. So we did patients, we talked to people who work for private companies, we talked to some privacy experts, we talked to patients, obviously, because they're very important. We talked to people from research charities. We did a bunch of desk research, and we also did some case studies. So we were very thorough. If you ever need to check our working. So what did we come up with? So we made a bunch of recommendations on these topics. So we talked about the professionalisation of NHS analysts, we talked about privacy and security, we talked about trusted research environments, which you're going to hear about loads today. Actually, NHS is rebranded as secure data environments because it's more than just research, and trust can't be guaranteed or taken for granted. We also talked about open working, which Will has just talked to you about, information governance, ethics and participation, everybody's favourite topic, mine anyway, but everybody else likes to call us the party poopers and and data curation. So what did we say in all of these topics? Well, as Will alluded to, we made 185 recommendations because we are just that pedantic and annoying. But as a brief summary, we said that you should professionalise the NHS analytical workforce and take them seriously, give them good job descriptions, make sure they have proper career development pathways. Privacy and security. Pseudonymisation and dissemination is not enough to protect against privacy infringement. So, make TREs or secure data environments the default for working with NHS data. Then, make an open analytics policy for the NHS, so all code that's being developed on the NHS's data should be openly available so that you don't have what you have right now, which is 200 plus different NHS organisations doing the same thing in multiple different ways and not sharing the code. IG ethics and participation, so once you've got TREs in place, you have solved, quote unquote, the privacy problem. You still need to care about purpose, but that means you can streamline your process and therefore give people access to data quicker. And then data curation, even though everybody thinks it's the really boring bit, in fact it's the really serious and really important bit. So make sure that data curation is recognised as a technical domain and fund it properly. And so what has happened since? Since we published in April the 7th, 2022, the government has come out with its Data Saves Lives policy. It has also published the Secure Data Environment policy and a whole bunch of other things, and a £250 million investment in the development of secure data environments for research and development. And that is done.